So, as you can tell, it's untangling life's knots. I know that sometimes I think we are all looking for a good detangler, and without being too sexist, I think that that's probably more of an issue for women than it is for men in terms of looking for a good detangler, right? Because when you have hair like mine, you don't really worry a lot about tangles. You're just grateful you have some still left. Or it starts growing in areas where you never thought it would grow, like your ears and other places. It's just crazy. But I'd like to talk to you about detangling life's knots, because I think we all run into knotty problems from time to time and wonder, is there a way in which we can kind of unravel the things that concern us? And the answer is yes. There is. And the text for the message this morning is taken from the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. There was a wedding in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. Jesus and his disciples were guests also. When they started running low on wine at the wedding banquet, Jesus' mother told him, "They're just about out of wine." And Jesus said, "Is that any of our business, Mother? I mean, yours or mine? This really isn't my time." She went ahead anyway, telling the servants, "Whatever he tells you to do, just do it." Now, 6 stoneware water pots were there, used by the Jews for ritual washings. Each held 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus ordered the servants, "Fill those pots with water." And they filled them to the brim. "Now, fill your pitchers and take them to the host," Jesus said, and they did. When the host tasted the water that had become wine, and then parenthetically, he didn't know what had happened, but the servants, of course, knew, he called out the bridegroom, "Hey, everybody I know begins with their finest wines, and after the guests have had their fill, brings out the cheap stuff. But you've saved the best until now." Now, I want you to imagine yourself in a dark room like that, with the windows closed, the curtains drawn, the blinds are blocked. It's hard to believe in that darkness that there's actually daylight outside of those drapes. So you grope around, you're trying to feel your way across the floor. Maybe you take a stop, but you're disoriented and you're unsure of exactly where you're headed. Progress is slow, the journey can be painful. Maybe you stubbed your toe or you bruised your shin. It's hard to walk around in a really dark place. It's harder still to walk around in a really dark world. But we try, don't we? We try to walk around in a dark world, and we get wounded in the process. We trip over problems. We bump into each other in the shadows. Sometimes we find ourselves ramming into the walls, but occasionally one of us makes a discovery. Because reaching through the blackness, a hand actually finds the curtains and then the window latch. Hey, these walls, they have windows. And then the drapes are pulled back and the window is open. And now sunlight floods the room. What was dark is now bright. What was opaque is now clear. What was stale is now fresh. With the light comes a certain peace, even a certain degree of power, and a desire to then move closer to that light, and a confidence in our steps to be able to move forward. Our timid steps are replaced by certainty in our walk, a certainty in moving through these corridors of life that all of us traverse, opening one window after another to finally illuminate the darkness. And all it took was opening the curtains and raising the window. And church, prayer does the same thing. Prayer is that window that God has placed in the walls of our world. If we leave it shut, it becomes a very, very cold and dark place. But if we throw back the curtains, we can see God's light. If we open the window, we can hear God's voice. If we open the window of prayer and we invoke the presence of God, then he's palpable. We can see it, we can feel it, and we can sense it. And here's what I mean. Imagine that you are at your best friend's wedding reception. The two of you have talked about this particular day since you were kids, and now that day is finally here. The ceremony was great. The wedding was beautiful. The minister was flawless, and the vows were honest. I mean, it was a terrific day. And you said, I'll take care of the reception. Because you had said that a long time ago. You had volunteered to do that. I'll take care of your reception. It's the least I can do as your best friend. So you planned the best party possible. You hired the band. You rented the hall. You created the meal. You decorated the room. And then you asked Aunt Tessie to bake the wedding cake. Truth be told, I had an Aunt Tessie who was a fabulous baker. So here's a picture of Aunt Tessie. That looked an awful lot like her, actually. So now the band is playing, the guests are milling about, and Aunt Tessie is nowhere to be seen. Everything is here, everything except for the wedding cake. So you ring her up. Unfortunately, Aunt Tessie has been napping. She thought the wedding was next week. Great. Now what are you going to do? Talk about a problem. Everything is here for the wedding except for the wedding cake. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Well, maybe it might. It's exactly the dilemma that Jesus' mother Mary was facing, at least sort of. You know, the wedding was moving, the guests were celebrating, but the wine was gone. Back then, wine to a wedding was like cake is to a wedding today. So you've probably been to weddings, maybe of late. Can you imagine a wedding without a wedding cake? Kind of hard to believe. Well, then they couldn't imagine a wedding without wine. Because to offer wine during that cultural period of time was to show respect to your guests. Not to offer wine at a wedding was, well, it was bordering on the insulting. And in really egregious circumstances, it could have been cited as a misdemeanor to not offer wine to your guests. In other words, it was a criminal offense. So Mary is now facing a social problem. You know, it's a foul up. It's a snafu. Snafu is an acronym. System now all fouled up. Snafu. It's a calamity on somewhat a common scale. I mean, there's no need to call 911 for a missing wedding cake or wine that is now quickly disappearing, but you can't sweep the embarrassment under the rug and avoid it either, right? And when you think about it, most of the problems that we face in life are somewhat similar in scope. Seldom do we have to deal with dilemmas that are on some national scale? Or our problems are not something that typically have worldwide impact and import. Seldom do our crises ever rock the Richter scale. Usually, the waves that we ride are made by pebbles, not by an ocean. We're late for a meeting. We leave something at the office. A coworker forgets a report. Mail gets lost and traffic gets snarled. I mean, those are the problems, generally speaking, that we face. And generally speaking, the waves rocking our lives are not life-threatening. But then again, they can be, because a poor response to a simple problem can light a fuse. What begins as a snowflake can then snowball into an avalanche unless proper care is taken of the problem. For that reason, then, please note how Mary reacted to the situation with the wine running empty. Her solution, I think, is a very practical plan for untangling life's knots. She said in John chapter 2, verse 3, "They have no more wine," she told Jesus. That's it. That's all she said. Mary didn't go crazy. She simply assessed the problem and gave it to Jesus. Charles Kettering, who was a famed inventor and one-time head of research at General Motors, said the following, quote, "A problem well stated is half solved." And I think Mary would have liked that, because that's exactly what she did. She defined the problem. They have no more wine. Now, granted, Mary could have exploded. She could have said, "Well, why didn't you plan better?" Or, "There's not enough wine. Whose fault is this anyway? You guys never get anything right. If anything is to be done right around here, I have to do it myself." Or Mary could have imploded. "This is all my fault. I've failed. I'm to blame. I deserve it. If only I had majored in college in the culinary arts. I'm a failure in life." You know, it is so easy for all of us, myself included, to focus on everything but the solution. But Mary didn't do that. She simply looked at the knot, she assessed it, and took it to the right person. Essentially, Mary is thinking, I've got one here that I can't untie, son. I can't untie this knot, Jesus. And when they started running low on wine, Jesus' mother told him they're just about out of wine. And I want you to note that she took the problem to Jesus before she took the problem to anyone else. An acquaintance of mine told me about a deacon's meeting that he was once involved in. And apparently, at least at this particular deacon's meeting, there was a little bit more agitation than agreement in the meeting. And after a very lengthy and somewhat heated discussion, someone suggested, quote, "Why don't we pray about it?" To which another of the deacons said, quote, "Has it really come to that? I mean, these are deacons of the church, right? Has it really come to prayer?" What causes us to think of prayer as the last option rather than the first? Well, I think there's at least two reasons. Feelings of either independence or feelings of insignificance. Sometimes we're really independent. We begin to think we're big enough to solve our own problems. For instance, at our home, We've had a banner year. Our youngest daughter just finished college. Another daughter got a promotion resulting in better pay and better benefits. And another mother of two is taking steps toward a career change other than just being a mom, because being a mom is a career. Our youngest son and his wife are doing pretty well in the entertainment industry in Hollywood. Another son is to HVAC like MacGyver is to Tinker Toys. And another son is sitting in the back. He's an attorney and the office and youth minister here. Now, my wife and I applaud and celebrate each accomplishment that our children have made. And their maturity and their mobility are both good and certainly very necessary. But I hope they never get to the point where they are too grown up to call their mom or their dad. And I think, church, God feels the same way. Now, other times, we don't feel independent, we feel insignificant. Because we think, sure, Mary can take her problems to Jesus because she's his mom. But God doesn't want to hear my problems. He's got famines and earthquakes to deal with. I don't want to trouble him with my messes. And if you've actually ever given that some thought, I want you to consider what the psalmist said in Psalm chapter 18, verse 19. Because he delights in me, he saved me. Because he delights in me, he saved me. And you probably thought he saved you because of your decency. Or you thought he saved you because of your good works. Or you thought he saved you because of your good attitude or your good looks. Sorry. If that were the case, your salvation would have been lost when your language went south or when your works got weak. There are many, many reasons God saves you. Some of which are to bring glory to himself. One of which is to appease his justice. Another is to demonstrate his sovereignty. But one of the absolute sweetest reasons, in my opinion, why God saved you and me is because he's fond of you. He likes having you around. He thinks you're the best thing to come down the pike in a long time. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 62, verse 5, which is the same book from which Curtis was quoting this morning, it says, "As a man rejoices over his new wife, so your God will rejoice over you." Church, he loves you. He's fond of you. He wants to be part of your world. And with that being said, I want you to notice the sequence of events in the 3 verses that we explored in connection with Mary and the wine having run out. Jesus first ordered the servants fill the pots with water. So they filled the jars to the top. Number 2, he said to them, "Now fill your pitchers from the pots and take those pitchers to the host." So they took the water to the host. And 3, during the journey from spigot to sommelier, the water had become wine. Now, I want you to pay attention to the sequence. First, the jars are filled with water. Then Jesus instructs the servants to take the water, not the wine, take the water to the master. Now, if I'm the servant, I'm thinking I'm not real crazy about that particular idea. How is taking a pitcher of water to my master, who is my employer, how is that going to solve this problem? And what is the master going to say when I give him a cup of water? But I guess these servants were either naive enough or perhaps trusting enough to do exactly as Jesus said. And so the problem was solved. Note, if you would, that the water became wine after the servants had obeyed, not before. Now, what if the servants had refused? What if they'd said, "No, that's crazy, Jesus. No, we're not going to do that." Or to bring the point closer to home, what if you refuse? Or I refuse? What if you identify the problem, take it to Jesus, and then refuse to do what he says? Now that's possible, right? That's definitely possible. After all, God is asking you to take some pretty gutsy steps. For instance, money is beyond tight, right? But he still asks you to give. You've been offended, but he still asks you and me to forgive. Someone has blown the assignment, but he still asks you to be patient. And you can't see God's face, but he still asks you to pray. Now, these aren't commands for the faint of faith. But then again, he wouldn't ask you to do it if he thought that you couldn't. So go ahead. Next time you need to untangle life's knots, maybe you should follow Mary's example. Identify the problem, because in doing so, you'll half solve it. Present it to Jesus, because he is happy to help. And 3, do what he says, no matter how crazy the answer may be. And then my recommendation to you is get Aunt Tessie a new calendar. Would probably have averted the wedding situation. You know, church, we live in difficult and trying times, and some problems are knottier than others. And I think we have a tendency, first of all, to look inwardly to ourselves rather than to Jesus to solve it. But in solving the problem, even if we turn to Jesus, it's not usually our first reaction. It's sometime down the road. And as you know, each week I try and give you something to work on, a challenge. I'm challenging you this week that when you run into one of those knots in life, would you first reach out to Jesus by identifying the problem and then leaving it to him? Note that Mary didn't go into some sort of lengthy description to Jesus by explaining to them how they ran out of wine. There are some commentators that believe, because of the relationship of the couple that was getting married, that there was a relationship familially with Mary and with Jesus, and that Mary was actually kind of the wedding coordinator. And if that were true, then she would have probably been able to tell Jesus all the problems leading up to running out of wine. You know, we're having problems with our transportation system of late. That special wine that I ordered, that vintage got wiped out in a drought. And then when they went to another vintner, then it didn't work in the bottles, and then he couldn't find the corks, and then he couldn't find the shipping company, and then he couldn't find, and she could have probably given him an hour's worth of explanation as to why the problem now exists. But she didn't. And I think sometimes we spend too much time trying to explain how the problem came up, how that knot came up, as opposed to just saying, this is a problem, Jesus, help me. It's not complicated, church. It's pretty simple. But unfortunately, we have a tendency of kind of making it a lot more difficult than it needs to be. And I'm not saying that your particular problems in life aren't difficult. We all have them. And I'm not minimizing the impact that they might have in your life. All I'm simply asking you to do is reach out to Jesus first. Use him as the first resort, not the means of the last resort. And then number two, when you do, don't overcomplicate the situation. Do you think Jesus does not know what you're telling him? I mean, that's the interesting thing about prayer, right? So we go to God in prayer and share things, concerns, problems. But it's not like he doesn't know about them. The whole idea of prayer is to help our lives align through the Spirit with him. And so we're simply trying to communicate with him so that we're acting as one. We're not surprising him with something he doesn't know. So he knows how the problem came up, and he knows what the solution is. But he's not going to enter in and help unless you ask. So this week, don't overcomplicate things. When you have a knotty problem in life, go to Jesus first, identify the problem, and let him provide for you the answer.